Patrick, j'ai pris la liberté parce que je vous ai croisé dans le couloir. Et oui, donc là, j'ai tombé sur cette œuvre parce que c'est incroyable. Donc on voulait vous remercier parce que, en fait, moi je veux vous remercier parce que vous avez quand même avec Evelyne fait énormément, surtout depuis la première édition de Chenin Blanc Congrès, qui s'appelait le Congrès à l'époque, maintenant c'est Célébration. Mais là, je voulais partager avec vous, c'est une œuvre, and it has all the proceedings of the International Chenin Blanc Congress, findings and everything that was discussed at the first Congress. And it took years, because you did this with the ISHS. It's not an easy task. And it took years to compile, actually a book on everything that was discussed and the findings that were found. So, Patrick, félicitations. Merci beaucoup. Voilà. Et le prochain, ce sera Étienne. Hein? Étienne, are you taking the... No. Et en fait, on le vend aussi à 50 €, c'est ça? D'accord, il est disponible. C'est 50 €. Et vous serez là, juste avant déjeuner, si on est intéressé pour... d'Afrique du Sud, j'ai vu ça. C'est très bien. Donc, merci pour l'Afrique du Sud, surtout, d'avoir soutenu tout ça. Et aussi à Advini, Afrique du Sud aussi. Hein, vous me gardez 4, 5 pour les 5 domaines. Voilà. Merci. Donc, si vous êtes prêts, we're going to start the next session, which is all about balancing flavors. And we have our moderator, Jamie Goode, who does not really need any introduction. From the UK, you're a journalist, speaker, educator. I've seen you done wonderful interventions all over the world. In South Africa at the last Congress that we held in 2022. Welcome here in Angers. And you will lead the discussion with Maret du Toit, like we say in South Africa. She's a professor in oenology at the University of South Africa. And I just want to share with you that all these wonderful winemakers that you've seen from South Africa, the wine you tasted from Kleine Zalse, from L'Avenir, even Ken Forrester, Aleit, Chris, toi aussi, from Bosman Wineries, they all came through the hands of Professor Maret du Toit. So, wonderful gratification to see what this generation is doing. And then I would like to call Corlea Fourie, who is from Bosman Family Wines in Wellington in South Africa. And you will share some of your knowledge on the subject. Nathalie Brown from Rococo Wines, California, that we tasted yesterday. Fantastic. And Thibaud Boudignon from Domaine Thibaud Boudignon, Anjou, France. Je ne l'ai pas vu. Voilà, il est là. Voilà. Bienvenue. Parfait. Over to you, James.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this session. I think we have a really interesting group of people here. And so just to set out what we're going to do, I'm going to give a quick introduction to the ideas behind this session. And then Maret is going to give a talk based on some really interesting research, looking at many aspects of Chenin. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a tasting of 4 wines. And these are all Savennières, all from schist. And what we're going to look at is the various elements that then, beyond the place and the soil type, then impact upon the flavour of the wines. So we'll be doing that in the context of a discussion, and I'm going to ask each of these panellists, after I've given my introduction, to kind of introduce themselves, what they're doing, why they do what they do. But first of all, a little bit of a sort of theoretical sort of look at what we're going to be doing. And this is an idea I kind of wanted to explore. So to explain this diagram, what we have here is we have viticulture. So the goal of viticulture is to produce an inoculation medium for yeasts and bacteria. So that sounds odd, but really, we're thinking yesterday, we had a really interesting session yesterday talking about that journey from soils to flavour in grapes. And I think Gabrielle did really well explaining how it's a very indirect route that's reliant on plant physiology. Now, if we're thinking about terroir, basically terroir is realised through the process of microbial action, through fermentation. So we've got yeast and bacteria. And then we've got the process of élevage afterwards, bringing up the wine. And it's only after these processes that you get to wine flavour. And when it comes to wine flavour components, there are 3 routes for those wine flavour components, these elements of wine flavour to get to the wine. The first is directly to come from the grapes, then to survive fermentation, to survive élevage. And so we're thinking about compounds like methoxypyrazines. They're present in the grapes, they survive the fermentation process, they survive élevage, and they are present in the wine. But by far the majority of flavour active components in wine are produced during the process of fermentation, firstly from precursors that are present in the grapes that are then modified by the actions of yeast and bacteria, but also quite significantly by things that were never in the grapes that are produced directly by the actions of the metabolism of yeasts, but then also bacteria. And this is really important. So what we're tasting in terroir, the last stage for terroir to have its influence is in this medium, this microbial inoculation medium. So the must, or the must and the skins. That's the last time terroir has its chance to make its mark. And if you taste, must, just, if you taste it, you can't taste terroir very much. It kind of doesn't taste like wine, it's not wine. Whether it's from a fancy vineyard or a rubbish vineyard, it's very hard to taste the differences at juice stage. But that juice is really important because this is an inoculation medium that then alters the way that the yeast and bacteria behave. So that bacterial and yeast, I include bacterial because we kind of forget about them, but mainly we're talking about the yeasts. Those yeasts, obviously the strain of the yeast matters, but its behaviour is largely determined by the properties of that inoculation medium. So that's kind of like a little bit of context there, just thinking about this from a sciencey sort of way. So what your viticulture aims to do is aims to produce an inoculation medium that then produces something that's really interesting. And the mysterious thing is that we taste these wines from different places and they taste different. So this is just absolutely fascinating that through all these indirect processes, we end up with something in the glass that tastes different and distinctive and hopefully reflects its place. So just a quick run through of some of the factors that will alter the flavour of the wine. And we're looking at the vineyard here, so banging through them quickly. Soil type. Soils matter. Soils really do matter. And the interesting thing is that, most of the texts that I read say that, following Séguin's work in the 80s in Bordeaux, they say that it's the soil water retention properties that are key for terroir. But actually, I think soil chemistry matters as well. But that's another discussion. That's another talk entirely. Vine material, super important. So we've got clone, or whether it's Massol selection material. Vine age matters. Rootstocks matter as well. Rootstocks are often forgotten. Unless you're planting ungrafted vines, the rootstock is a really vital component in how the vine behaves. There's a lot of signalling that comes from the roots. You've got different species down there, and it's signalling to the above ground portion of the vine about how to behave. And that's kind of interesting. One other thing, we talked about the old vineyards and their resilience. And this is an aside. I think it would be really good if someone did the same sorts of experiments that Susan Simard did in the old growth forests in BC, in Canada, where she looked at the trees and found that the trees were connected to each other through mycorrhizal associations, joining the roots of different trees, and the trees shared nutrients between each other. And you can do this by isotopically labeled carbon, and you put it in one plant and you find it comes out in the other. And it would be super cool if we could show that in an old vineyard there is an interconnectivity that's happening at the fungal level through the roots, because this happens in forests. wouldn't it be cool if we could show that one of the reasons that old vineyards show resilience is because of some level of interconnectivity? That's just an aside. Training, trellising, obviously big factor on the performance of the vine and then the flavour of the wine, and we're going to hear some more about that. Competition, obviously we're talking about in vineyards now, we want to have an agro-ecosystem approach. We want to have biodiversity. So what's the effect of competition on vines that then affects the flavour of the wines? Yield, obviously. Water availability, this is a critical one. Water availability is becoming one of the main issues now, I think, in viticulture globally. Climate and weather. Climate's an average. A vine never sees climate. Vine only sees the weather of a year. So I think sometimes we overemphasize climate in a region, in terroir, because actually you see stable differences from year to year in terroir, even though the weather is very different. Vine nutrition, key one, harvest date, presence of botrytis, homogeneity of ripeness, fruit zone, sun exposure. These all factor into the flavour. These are vineyard factors that are going to change the way that the wine tastes. And then in the winery, so what do? Do you destem? Do you destem in the field with a machine harvester? Do you use whole clusters? Do you have skin contact? What about press? Press fractionation is a huge one. So where do you make the press cut? Also, how clean do you go to barrel or to tank? What settling do you use? Do you stir the lees if you're going to barrel, or do you have some barrels dirty and some barrels clean? Then we've got oxidation and protection of the must. Huge issue there. So do you want to have brown juice or do you want to have clear juice for your ferment? And then inoculation or wild ferment yeast is a huge issue, such a major topic. And I think Chris alluded to the fact that maybe we could consider native populations of yeasts present in the vineyard when you use wild ferments to be an element of terroir. There's lots to say about that. Sulfite use, that's a big one. Acidification or not. Nutrient additions. Nutrient additions are kind of interesting because if we think about the inoculation medium that viticulture is creating, that inoculation medium is going to be changed by nutrient additions. So effectively, you could be changing the expression of terroir quite significantly by adding nutrients. So these are just a few of the factors, I think, that shape the flavour of the wine. And as we proceed in our discussions, we're going to be looking at how the winemakers here, so the vignerons, the wine growers here, make these choices, considering what they've got in terms of their vineyards, and how that shapes the flavour of the wines. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Maret.
Thank you, Jamie, and I want to thank Etienne for the opportunity to come and present. I think something that links from the first session yesterday until the previous one. South Africa decided, because Chenin is one of our major cultivars, and to better understand this, we convinced our industry to put funding behind how do we understand Chenin Blanc. So it's from the trellis to the taste and back. So we need to understand what is the impact of trellising, because in South Africa there's a lot of trellising systems used, and how does that translate to taste, everything Jamie presented before. And if we know what drives a specific trellising system or a style of Chenin, how can we use that information to go back to decide how do we manage the vineyard to get to that aim in the end. So obviously this is a multidisciplinary project, and there's lots of interactions between everything. So if we have to summarize, for us as South Africa, it's all about producing premium Chenin Blancs or premiumization of Chenin. So profitability, sustainability, the style of wine, the brand, the image of South African Chenin Blancs. And as I say, this is a very ambitious project, and hopefully by the next Chenin conference, I'm not sure who's going to say anything. Is there a next one? We will be able to come back and really present what are the findings and how can we use this to drive Chenin even further than what we know today. So I will present, if you can see, there's viticultural aspects. How does that translate through to the wine? Because obviously we have a model vineyard, so we established a vineyard on our experimental farm with 19 different trellising systems that are used on the same terroir and soil to really be able to compare the impact of trellising through the wine system. Then obviously we've got a component from juice to wine that Jamie just highlighted. Everything you do in the vineyard gives you a specific composition. How does that translate from the sensory space? Then obviously all the data generated, how do we mine that? Somebody spoke about yesterday about the data and how important that is to really understand all the aspects from the grape, from the soil, through the climate, right through to what the consumer has in the bottle. So for us, it's about identifying distinctive drivers of Chenin characteristics and where those originate from. So I'm going to give a few examples. I was told 15 minutes. You have to make sure you finish in 15 minutes. So the first student is working on how does trellis systems shape the future of Chenin Blanc. So how do we untangle the vines and take it through to what we know? As I say, we have 19 different trellising systems. And if we just, in 2024, we had the opportunity where the vines bear their first grapes, where we could do the lay of the land to understand how these 19 shape and how are they different. So in the end, after measuring all the standard viticultural parameters, we could see that there's basically 3 distinctive groups in terms of vegetative and reproductive performance. So the single vines, there was a reduction in leaf area, and all of this in the end impacts the grape because they're either more shaded or not, with a grape composition that you will start off to balance the flavors in the wine. The vertical shoot positioning vines, everything was quite, I would say, constant. And then your divided or split canopies, you had an increase in leaf area, an increase in yield, and your phenology was faster. So you can see there at the top that the posted and bush vines had the fastest and the best leaf area and lay of the land. So obviously from the 19, there's no way we can keep on using 19 systems from a research perspective. So we chose 6 trellising systems from the 3 distinctive groups that we had. And then obviously this year we really had the opportunity to dive into these 6 trellising systems in much more detail. So obviously we looked at the microclimate, the bunch zone environments, to see how that shapes, and we could see that the bush vines and the other canopies, there was it was the warm up in the system because of the density, more leaf area, and they also cool down more rapidly. Whereas some of the other systems, there was a maintenance of a constant canopy temperature within the bunch zone, which obviously then impacts the way the berries handle themselves and the composition that we will have in the end. We also then re-looked at the vegetative response because remember, it's very young vines. So this year the vines was really in full production, and we could see that there were significant differences how the vines handled themselves. So the vertical shoot positioning, there was more vigorous growth. In contrast to your posted vine and bush vines, that increased the vigor of the shoots, the main leaf traits, and it increased the lateral leaf reduction, where some of your VSP or vertical shoot positioning systems had the weakest overall vegetative development per shoot. So the question is, how does this translate to what we're supposed to discuss in this session? Is what does the grapes provide the winemaker to take forward depending on the trellising system and the viticultural practices that they promoted. So obviously we looked at the main factors that anybody will measure: sugar, acidity, the yield of the vines. And we can see that VSP ripened the fastest of all the systems. And then obviously this translated to accumulation of sugar, the acidity, and the pH of the wines. And currently we're measuring all the major metabolites or composition that determines many of the end flavors in the wine. Like Jamie said, what does the grape provide to the microbes to take forward then to produce the wines? Then we had a student who basically, or we have two students that started this year with their master's study. The one is looking at the selection of yeast. How does yeast influence the fermentation? And as Jamie said, what happens if you add nitrogen to the wines or nutrients for the yeast? How does that alter the wine style or the wine profile? So in 2024, the first student looked also at the lay of the land, and we again saw that there's basically three distinct groupings depending on the trellising system that was used. So the pH, you can see, varied between the systems, between 3 and 3.5, and obviously wine, Chenin, freshness, acidity is a critical part. So obviously certain trellising systems might not be the most optimal for certain terroirs to get that freshness, acidity for longevity of the wine in the bottle. The titratable acidity also varied depending on where the pH lie. And the one interesting aspect related to how the yeast performs in the fermentation is we saw that the YAN, the yeast assimilable nitrogen, differed quite enormously, and it was not the ammonium. The ammonium was relatively constant between the trellising system, but it was actually due to the amino acid composition where the difference was, and we all know amino acid is critical for the production of flavors in the wine. So we then said, and we only adjusted this must with ammonia to keep the difference from what the grapes provided into the fermentation. So this year we then decided to add an additional step. So we added 2 yeast, and we used one nutrient that is specifically formulated for Chenin Blanc to see how does this impact the fermentation kinetics of the fermentations. And we can then see in 2025 there was a big difference in the speed of fermentation. And we heard one of the previous winemakers on the stage said that these fermentations takes up to 3 months to complete, which is in the spontaneous form not bad. But you can see, depending on the selection of your yeast, you can drive the speed of your fermentation. And that in the end then will also translate. We saw that the use of nitrogen, ammonium had the biggest impact, where the complex nutrient actually performed a little bit slower than just adding ammonia. We know yeast prefers ammonium as nitrogen source. So making a selection, if you do make a selection of yeast to drive your fermentations, is a critical part of the balance of the flavor in the final wine. Then linking on to I think a big thing that came out in the previous discussion is how does the microbiome look of these different trellising systems, because the microbiology, as Jamie said, is the critical part that the grape actually provides that will determine your fermentation. And here you can see that we looked at the microbial diversity of the different trellising systems, and you can see that the bush vines and the posted vines actually had the most complex microbial diversity of all the trellising systems. So obviously it's a very closed system, and there the microbial. And that might be why the spontaneous and many of the old vines are posted vines or bush vines, and why those vines produce some of the most complex wines in the end. is because they're and that's what Chris said in his presentation of his wines, is that he believes the microbial complexity of the grape and the terroir is critical. And we can see that there were common yeast, obviously, in all the groups. And how does this actually transfer to the final balance? And that there were systems that had similar profiles. So this is the start of the fermentation that the grape actually provides. So this year we then repeated the experiment, but on the 6 trellising systems. And we can see that the bush vines took 3 times longer than the old. And does that mean that longevity of the fermentation actually provides a specific characteristic or style to the wine? And you can see some of the fermentations finished in around 25 days. So depending on the system, the grape composition will determine how fast your fermentation actually happens. And does speed impact the final balance? So obviously this now we are measuring all the major volatile aroma compounds to actually see how does that drive the final sensory aspect of these wines. Then the last part of the project that I'll present is how do we use information from Chenin Blanc wines. And here I have to thank Abby and the Chenin Blanc Association for all their support to help us to find the best single vineyard Chenin wines, because obviously we want to use those to characterize the wines from a sensory perspective. So you can see we used the whole of South Africa to collect wines, wooded wines, unwooded wines. We also included some bulk wines. We put it through sensory evaluation with an expert panel, meaning winemakers in South Africa. And we gave them a piece of paper to say, write whatever you think is there. And in the end, we could consolidate the aromas down to around 70 aromas. And obviously, the biggest distinction was with wooded and unwooded. And the least discriminant attributes, because I think it's in all Chenin wines, is your fruity, peach, and citrus characteristics, which obviously does not drive where the style goes, because that's the basis of Chenin wine. And then, as I say, we then, with this, we found 15 significant different aroma attributes that drives the different wines. And you can see there its characteristics from aged, caramel, herbaceous, passion fruit, guava. You can pick whatever your style of Chenin is. And for us now, it's what compounds drives these characteristics, to use this information to actually see how can you take that back to decide what do you do in the vineyard and what do you do in the cellar to balance those flavors that identifies the style of wine that you make. So the take-home message, obviously, everything starts in the vineyard. I'm a wine microbiologist, so obviously I'm downstream and I have to hear this from the colleagues, but it's really true. So the trellising system that you apply impacts the grape composition, and this is critical, I think, for Chenin, looking at climate change, sustainability, and vineyard management, to have information which of these systems will be optimal to drive the characteristics and the balance that you want in wine. So balance of the juice starts in the vineyard, and how do we manage this diversity of trellising systems in the cellar? And that's where the colleagues on the rest of the panel will enlighten us, and I'm also here to learn, to obviously implement, as everybody said. This conference has provided a lot of, I think, input into where do we want to drive Chenin from a research perspective and taking it forward. And with a collaboration between South Africa and France, I think there's a lot of opportunities to take this project also forward from an international and a global perspective. And what are the key driver aroma compounds? that will guide optimal vineyard management and cellar management for what we, and we is the royal we, as we would say in South Africa, here in France, is what do we want Chenin to be for the future? And that, I think, is our collective responsibility as a grouping, is to decide where do we go with Chenin. So it's all about trellis, to taste, and back. So obviously, as I say, South Africa Wine is our wine industry body that supports research, that saw this project as I would say, a flagship project for South Africa because of the positioning of Chenin that we've heard through the whole conference, how important it is, most plantings from a white wine perspective, and then the Chenin Blanc Association and everybody else that supervises students in this project. So, baie dankie, thank you, inkosi, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Maret. That was a really, really interesting, wide-ranging presentation. You did it in 17 minutes, which is amazing. Because when I saw Maret's slide deck, I thought, right, that's a 40-minute presentation. So I've been around science a long time, and so to actually nail it that quickly and to cover so many topics is brilliant. And you know, one of the most interesting findings for me there is this idea. I was thinking, yeah, trellis is going to affect for instance, it might affect the way that obviously yield, microclimate for the bunches, sun exposure and everything. But the most interesting finding is that you've shown that when you do wild ferments, the trellis system or training system is affecting the microbial ecology that's on the grapes that then leads through to fermentation. And that, for me, is a super interesting finding. I wasn't expecting that. And that's not something I've thought about, because I think this whole issue of micro... I mean, that's why I emphasized at the beginning this whole... Don't forget that wine is microbiological. And I know it seems like it doesn't... But microbes are super complicated and interesting. But the idea that a trellising type is affecting the actual, the stuff that grows on the grapes, that goes into the winery, that then affects the fermentation and kinetics and the actual outcome is a really, really interesting. But the one study I would love to see some evidence on is how much vineyard management affects what's on the grapes in terms of wild yeasts and bacteria, and in terms of then how that leads on to differences in fermentation. Because obviously in vineyards we're spraying fungicides all the time. And there's different ways of spraying fungicides, different fungicides you can use, but you can't grow grapes without fungicides because of downy and powdery mildew. So what's the impact of that fungicide application, how it's done, which sort of fungicides you use on the yeast that then end up doing the fermentation? That's super interesting. And I think the other thing is the whole ecological system in the vineyard. I was with Andrew Jefford in Spain. We went to see Torres and looking at the regenerative work they were doing. And they've been doing some regenerative trials. So obviously you're building a vineyard agro-ecosystem in a fairly arid climate, not too far away from South Africa, I guess, in Penedès in Spain. But the really interesting thing is we tried some wines made from the same block, but the regenerative trial and the conventional farming. It's conventional organic, but it was so it wasn't like and the wines did taste different. So I think this is another interesting question: is what's the influence as we move towards creating more biodiverse vineyards of the other stuff that grows in the vineyard as well? So these vineyard management techniques are maybe affecting the wine through affecting the microbial populations present on the grapes.
Yeah, I mean, in South Africa we have a regenerative project as well, but not in the Chenin vineyard. And one of the colleagues is definitely looking at the microbial ecology of regenerative versus standard practices. And I mean, there's definitely, I think, an impact on the soil microbiome, which in the end impacts the health status of the vine above ground. And Rosa, I think, is doing a lot of work also on the health of soil and the impact on the healthiness of the vine. So there's definitely indications also in literature where the information is coming out now from different groups in different of the world wine producing countries about the impact of regenerative farming. But it's maybe not directly on the bunch microbe, but it's related to the healthiness of the plant in the soil.
Cool, cool. So I wanted to speak to our wine growers now. So maybe Corlea, if you could start. Tell us about your place and tell us about the decisions you make in your place. So you've got this place and you've got lots of choices to make. How do you make those choices? How do you choose to farm? How do you choose to work in the winery that is informed by the place that you're in?
How long is a string?
You've got 47 minutes.
No. So maybe just for context, my name is Corlea Fourie. I'm the head of wine for Bosman Family Vineyards. We're a producer from South Africa and historically an 8th generation wine family. I think the most unique selling point for our business is the fact that we're also the most comprehensive vine nursery in the Southern Hemisphere. So when I speak from a winery perspective, I always speak from a viticultural perspective. Another thing is that we're very much into sustainability, also social impact. In our case, 26% of our business is owned by its eligible staff. And then the last thing, and the reason why I'm here, is the fact that we are totally besotted and passionate about Chenin Blanc. So that's where everything that I'm going to be saying today comes from. In terms of making decisions, it's obviously also linked to the product and the landscape. So if you could imagine 8 generations, they've been there for a very long time in a very specific valley in the Boervlei. And in the olden days, there weren't much options. The options were Cinsault and Chenin Blanc. And those grapes did so tremendously well that I didn't think that the farmers thought they needed anything else. And then in the 50s, grapes like Cabernet and Shiraz came to South Africa. And, these were modern. And the farmers, were really excited because they would make little bits of Cabernet. They would put it into that Cinsault and they would get a better price. So, there was this a new wave. On the other hand, it was also a time in which South African winemakers were traveling. They got the notion that temperature control in cellars were really important. And in that time, wineries chose either to modernize their cellars or to focus on viticulture, because it was exactly in that time where the vine nursery business was formalized. That's why, for instance, in one of our vineyards, it is an old vine project vineyard, was planted in 1952. That is still Massal selection, because by that time, the nursery system was not formalized yet. But yes, so the landscape changed because there was more information coming in. But the wonderful thing is that we're going back to a place where people are now replanting Cinsault and, in some way have never forgotten what Chenin as a grape can give them. And then maybe also just the duality of the work that I do. Having been working with the Bosman family now for 20 years, for a very long time, it was exactly head bottle washer, labeler, export manager, doing pump overs and in crazy times of the night. At the moment, the idea is looking at our basket of grapes, looking to those vineyards. Where will that vineyard fit into a commercial product which makes the most sense? And what is the regime that drives that? So on the one hand, wanting wines to be wonderful and almost trustworthy every year in a specific style, but then also having an old vine Chenin, 3rd oldest Chenin vineyard in South Africa, and have that wine tell its story in a very different way. And there's obviously very different ways to approach both of those things.
So what do you do in the wine? This is Ogdenhorst, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, so what do you do with that in terms of élevage? Because when I first started going to wineries, it would be like 2 choices, stainless steel or small oak. Mm-hmm. And now you go into a winery, even a big commercial winery, you're going to find stainless steel, you might find some concrete eggs, you might see some concrete tanks, you might find large format oak, not just barriques, puncheons. Then you might find some clay, some terracotta, some Arte Nova, or or even tava, or different sorts of clay, fired at different temperatures, or Kvevri, with different, and they can be lined or unlined. And then you might even find the wine globes and things like that. And so it's like there's this myriad choices now in terms of élevage, and all these choices then impact on the flavour of the wine.
Yes, and I think we were talking about it last night, that vineyards can actually take you on a totally new winemaking philosophy. And that's exactly what Op ten Oorstad did for me as a winemaker. I'm going to be honest, it is the vineyard that has taught me the most. So if you could imagine, in the 50s, as I said, people were closing cellars. They were focusing on viticulture, especially in my little town. And in 2004, our MD, the oldest son of the Bosman, said he wanted to make wine again. He went and did a harvest, came back. I think he was overwhelmed with the amount of work that winemaking actually was. And when I came along making wine in the same cellar, he was really happy for me to look after his barrels. At the end of that year, the new cellar, built onto the old 270-year-old cellar, was finished. And I only had two main jobs. The one was making a beautiful, generous red wine, which almost had to be the cash cow. We were going to be selling that very quickly, and that needed to fund quite a lot of things. And then he said, but we will be making Chenin. And I was really happy for that, because I had worked with Chenin in Wellington before. And we were, doing harvest. In the middle of harvest, he came to the cellar and he said, you know what, there's one vineyard I need to show you. And we went there. And as all of these stories goes, it's really, like those cinematic things on Instagram when you do your videos. It still feels like that day that he took me there. I mean, it must have been hot because it was Wellington, but these beautiful goblet vines, old and gnarly, were there, and he was just saying that they were supposed to be taken out. Low yielding, less than 7 tons, and 7 tons is what you put on the back of a tractor when you go to a cooperative cellar. So for all of its life, nobody had ever known what that grape tasted like. So we decided to bring in a small parcel to the cellar. We made 6 barrels, but they were all brand new because it was a new cellar. We didn't think about that too much. Anyways, and it was a inoculated fermentation, but even with all of that, 2 weeks afterwards, I thought that we would drink those barrels empty because it was spectacular. Decided to keep it, and in the same way, Rosa, the registry of the old vines then started, and then at some point, I think it was still in Stellenbosch, you had come to give the information, and at that day was the first day that we had realized that vineyard was the 3rd oldest vineyard in South Africa, Chenin vineyard. So you could imagine just that panic of knowing that it was supposed to be taken out and that we didn't. But I always think that it's the most amazing story, that a vineyard and the wine outcome of that, was what made us keep it. And since then, the idea, you need to think about these things so much. And if you spend time there, it went from commercial farming to organic farming, really also almost now from organic adapting to more of a regenerative. We needed a different toolbox for what organic was able to give us. And then from there, Peter Couve in the vineyard, it gets the cellar team to go to the vineyard to see the grapes that they're going to work with, because they don't get out much, but they can go and see that vineyard. And then from there into the cellar, basket press, and by the time it goes to barrel, 4th, 5th, 6th full barrel, Louis Latour, so never a new barrel. Fermentation in that, after fermentation, which takes a very long time, in my case, 3 months. Like the previous speaker, I've become grey, waiting, and then in the end we do a blend, which is then half in barrel and half in non-blot concrete egg. We bottle at the end of the year, we mature for a year in bottle, and then we release.
Cool. So, from South Africa to California, Nathalie, we don't see a lot of Chenin Blanc from California, but this is a speciality. Tell us about your place and how you do it.
I loved your story because my journey into Chenin Blanc was walking into an old vineyard and just falling in love with it. And that's really what started it for me about 10 years ago. I live in Paso Robles, California, which is kind of close to the coast in the center of the state. And through discovering this vineyard we now call Los Alamos 10 years ago, which was planted on its own roots in 1972, I slowly began to educate myself on the history of Chenin Blanc in California. And I love hearing the stories of South Africa and your country's journey with that grape, because It was the second most widely planted white variety in California for a number of decades, behind French Colombard, in case anyone's interested. And it really was, particularly in the post-World War II era, became very popular. A lot of vineyards were planted then. And then we saw a decline really in the 80s and 90s as a lot more international varieties. So again, this is a story we've heard a couple different places, but international varieties came in and really took over a lot of those plots. So when I found the Los Alamos vineyard in 1972, the story I learned of it was that it was originally, and my we've built our relationship with the Los Alamos property, as well as a few other Old Vine Central Coast vineyards, also with similar stories. We are now seeing the Los Alamos vineyard actually top off the varieties they had grafted onto the Chenin Blanc roots and then rework those now, I guess, 52-year-old roots back up into adult vines again. So Chenin Blanc, I do feel like we've kind of been a part of the journey in the United States and in California, but even 10 years ago, you know, I would make our wines and bring them to wine shops and restaurants, and buyers really didn't know what to do with my California Chenin. And more now, I visit accounts and reach out to people in the industry, and people are interested and eager to talk about it. You know, I often get asked by Californians and Americans if I am making Loire-style Chenins or South African-style Chenins. And my response is that I'm making California-style Chenins. There's so much to learn and to pull from both of these beautiful countries. And thank you, Etienne, for inviting me here. I'm flattered. It's an honor. But we make several different Chenin Blancs every year under the Rococo label. We make 3 single vineyard Chenins. They are all fermented in stainless steel drums. And really the idea behind that program is that we keep ourselves very hands-off in the cellar and, you know, really just let the site and the terroir speak through by being very consistent with each winemaking decision across the different wines. We also make a stainless steel blend that was in one of the seminars yesterday. And then we do make one oaked expression of Chenin Blanc. It's really just a nice way to study the diversity of what we can do with Chenin in the cellar using different winemaking techniques.
Very cool. Now, just aware that we've got 2 wines in front of us that we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is a miss. So the first 2 are both from the same vineyard, Clos du Papillon. And as you can see there, one is from the western side, one is from the eastern side. This is your region, Thibaud, yeah, Savinière. Can you just say something about Savinière briefly and about this site? I know it's not your wines, but it's...
No. So Savinière, I think, is 330 hectares of vines in potential. Half is planted. So it's on 3 communes. So you have 30 hectares of potential in Bushman, 270 in Savinière, and 30 in La Poissonnière. So we are located in La Poissonnière. I think when you think about Savinière, the style of Savinière is from the old chateau from Savinière, like you have Chambreau, Château des Vaux, La Roche-aux-Moines, Coulet-de-Serran. So it makes full-bodied wine with a lot of power and salinity. Rather than on La Poissonnière, for example, for me there is 3 types of terroir in Savinière. Some of the sand that makes more perfume, fine wines. Some full-bodied wines, like the wines that you have on the right side of the road if you go to Angers. And in La Poissonnière, I think we have a mix of these 2 kind of terroirs. So we are on the extreme west of the appellation. We have sands and schist. So sands allow to have finesse and freshness. It's warm also very quickly, and the schist give the power and the salinity of the grapes. So it shows that these 2 wines for me is a good expression of what Savinière is. because these two wine growers, one come from the Anjou side, and I think is Domaine des Baumards. I think is one of the biggest producer of Savagnières, and Domaine du Closel, Château des Vaux is an old growers of Savagnières, which that kind of style of Savagnière. So, and the particularity of these two wines is from the 21 vintage, which is well known for us because everything was damaged by the frost. So I don't know for that growers, but I believe that roughly 100% was destroyed. So I think that the yield is very low. To speak about our winery, so we created everything. As I'm not from the region, as I told you, when you speak about Savagnières, half of the appellation is not planted. So my goal was to find where the rest is, and I thought that on the book, the Claude Lahut was very well known to produce good wine at the beginning of the century. So when I arrived at the Claude Lahut on a Sunday morning, I had the impression that it will be there. So we had the luck to start from a white page, and the particularity of our vineyard is that we are only Massal selection, and we mix Massal selection. So we got 10 different Massal selection. The root stuff is Rupestris du Lot, because I had the chance to buy a house in Savagnières where the Professor Guillory made studies, and at the end of his life, he made a books, and he said that for him the best root stuff is Rupestris du Lot, because he's able to produce good wine. So that's the Claude Lahut for us is 2.5 hectares of vines. In front of the Claude Lahut, we've got the Claude Frémine and a new project called Claude Devant le Jeu. Everything is organic. For us, 21 got a special flavor because I was distracted by the frost in 17, 100%. I didn't produce any bottle in 17. Then I thought, okay, if I succeed to pass over this drama, it will be better in the future. And then 19 arrived, and it was the same for us. It was early in the season, so that's why we succeed to produce 20% of a normal production. So I thought we need to invest to protect our vineyard. So now everything is protected by the frost with a cable that allow us to warm the buds when it's...
so heated cable?
Yes.
Is this a throw light or is it some other system?
No, it's a cable that warms the bed. And in 21, for example, it was the first year that we invest in 20, because if you speak about the frost, for me, it's not an economical things. It's for us, it was so dramatic that it was impossible for me to deal with. It's so traumatic. So that's why we invest, and to say, because our goal is to produce grapes, so we need to save grapes. For us, what's feed our family is to have grapes. So that's why we invest. And in 21, we succeed to save all the crops from the Claude Lahut. That's why every year we made that decision to protect everything. In fact. The way we think about the vineyard is, and 21 is the for me one of the points that, and the key for the vineyard. I remember that I had if you think about 21, it's 7 nights outside to fight against the frost. So it showed that the team was very very important, and the will to protect the entire harvest, entire crop, and after it was humid and with a high mildew pressure, and also thanks to the job that the team made, we succeed to deal with that, to have a beautiful canopy, and when the harvest arrived, we were so proud about where we came from and what we are doing this year. I believe that 100% of the potential of the wines is in the field, and I'm agree with Rosa to say that terroir is also a question of mine, of the will the team have with you, the spirits, the choice that you decided to do in the vineyard, and also winemaking. After we adapt every year the way we want to age the wine regarding the quality of the vintage, the kind of vintage it is. But it's sure that for me, a good viticulture allow you to add nothing in the cellar. And if you had to add nutriments in the cellar, is there something wrong in the field? So our goal is to take care as much as possible in the vineyard. For example, this year, 14 persons were with us in the field to take care as much as possible as the vines.
So what's your preferred élevage? Is it wood or
yes, 100% on wood for us, but we have many size of barrels. We had the possibility to age half of the production of the wines in foudre. We've got 600 liters stocking jar from 10 hectoliters foudre. So we use it, for example, in a vintage such as 22, because we think that the foudre preserve the freshness, the acidity of the fruits, rather than smaller cask give roundness, give tannins. So, for example, in 21, we don't age the wine as we do in 22. 21, the acidity was high. For us, we don't have any trouble with the difference of maturity because of the frost, and we also made only one picking, because the goal is to have the diversity of each Chenin Blanc that we have in the field, because we believe that diversity makes complexity, and it's the same way in the cellar. So 21 that you will taste, you have 30% new oak, because in that kind of vintage, oak allows us to give tannins to add a little bit more structure to the wines, and after it goes 1 year in barrels and 6 months in tank before we bottle the wines.
So presumably you're doing wild ferment, yeah?
Yes. But for us, it's like we do in aging. We made a selection every year of yeast. We want to have a bibliothèque of yeast at the domain, because in 23, for example, the noise that was in the vineyard doesn't sound good. So we believe that we can't do anything. So we take the yeast that we selected.
Oh, right. So do you culture them then, these yeasts? So they're strains from your own ferments?
We've got our own laboratory in Nantes. It's a laboratory that is specialty of yeast. So each year we selected a plot and see and to have new yeast. So now we've got 6 different yeast that we don't use if we don't need it.
I see. So if you have a growing season where you're looking at what's happened in the growing season, you think this is a healthy microbial ecology in this vineyard, whereas 23 presumably was that awful
23 was
downy mildew year. Yeah?
23 was very difficult because there was a lot of we had to deal. We sort a lot of grapes in the vineyard. There is a acetic population, botrytis population, and also another thing that wasn't good. And we saw directly that when we analyzed the juice from the press, that was in the vineyard, was in the cellar. So we don't want to take risks. Yeah. So that's why we decided to put our own yeast.
Would you sulfite the must a little bit before you add your yeast then?
Sorry?
In that situation, would you add some sulfites?
We always add sulfur, because for us to use indigene yeast without sulfur is playing too much with the nature. So it showed that we always add sulfur to the pressure, and so for us sulfur is not a question because for me to do not add sulfur and to play with indigenous yeast, it's sometimes difficult. So
Natalie, just what's your approach with yeast? Do you use? I think this is a really interesting discussion because what it shows is a sort of open-mindedness. Because some people say we only use wild ferments, and this is an intelligent approach, I think, which is say, well, we're going to, if we need to make sound wines, and in these sorts of vintages, to have our own yeasts available to use is fantastic. Sorry, I was getting Natalie.
Because I think the problem is that. Now when people think about vin de terroir, they think you have to do nothing. But the man, for me, is a part of the terroir. Yeah. So the decision you take makes the wines from the lieu where you come from. So for me, it's sure that now with the climate changing, with everything, the winemaker always needs to adapt himself to what's happened, because my goal is to make the best one as possible each year, and the work that we do in the vineyard allow us to have a good quality every year. And that's why for us there is no recipe. I can say to you, okay, it's 20% New York and everything, we had this kind of yeast. There's nothing to say. You always have to adapt regarding what's the nature challenging you.
Every vintage is different, and I've learned over the years to never hold on to any dogma, because I will disprove myself or go against my own dogma 1 or 2 years later. In 2022, we had I'd say an average warm growing season that ended with just a really, really intense heat wave, and as fruit was coming in, we saw that the typical either indigenous yeasts that we might use on certain ferments or the commercial yeasts we would use on other ferments actually weren't even able to successfully ferment the high fructose content of some of the must that we had. And we had to switch gears and use completely different commercial yeast than we normally do. On the flip side, then we had a very cool growing season in 2023. We don't deal with a lot of rot where we live. It's very warm in the summer. It hardly rains in the summer. It's very dry and windy. 2023 was not like that. And for the first year, we were making decisions in the vineyard and in the cellar that were not part of our typical wheelhouse to make the best wine possible, to make clean wines. We have with... So we do source the grapes for our Chenin Blanc program. We grow our own fruit on site where the winery is, but we also source grapes and bring in fruit from other vineyards. And so when we're talking about like what is the indigenous yeast that's coming in, and then what is that ferment happening in the cellar, a lot of times we'll use the terminology spontaneous ferment versus native ferment, because there's so many yeasts, some are indigenous, some are native, and some I want, some I don't. So a lot of times we'll talk about spontaneous fermentation happening that we may or may not supplement with commercial yeast strains, again, depending on the vintage, depending on the incoming bricks, just the health of the fruit. We really make, I think that whenever I try and rely on what I've done in previous years, that's when I make mistakes, because every vintage is different, and every year we learn new things.
Have you ever made a mistake wine?
Well, yeah, so my first vintage ever of Chenin got stuck, and I was not planning on making a demi-sec Chenin. And that wasn't really also, like, I would say an accepted thing to have, by the glass at a restaurant in California. And I had to get behind it and own it, and that now I encourage some of my wines to get stuck every once in a while. So there's been mistakes for sure, but I've learned from all of them.
Yeah. So Corlea, you were saying you do a pied de cuve. Now this is a question I'm interested in. That maybe Maret or you can answer. It's like, so normally when you do wild fermentation, there's lots of different species of non-Saccharomyces yeast that start things off, right? Because the Saccharomyces cerevisiae is present in the vineyard, but at very, very low levels. So after a few days, you get this activity of the non-sacs producing all sorts of interesting compounds, gobbling up some nutrients, and then gradually Cerevisiae, a strain of several, or a few strains of Cerevisiae, kind of finish off the ferment. So if you do a Pierre de Cuve, do you kind of go straight when, are you already at the Saccharomyces cerevisiae stage when you use that to inoculate the ferment, or do you still have those wild yeasts as well? Because I guess when you make your Pierre de Cuve, you leave it a few days and you smell it just to smell it's okay, yeah, and then add it.
I'm going to be honest, it's not as scientific. When we went to Spain to, was it Chateau Pigao, they have a amazing laboratory in which they can see exactly what is in those things that they are adding to their wines. For us, it's more a matter of, as I said before, people are really important in our idea of making wine. So for my cellar team to go there, do a little bit of a harvest, see what they would be working with. I always believe if people can see the grapes in their natural environment before they come to the cellar, there's just so much more understanding of what we're working with. And some of my team have been harvesting with me for the last 20 years. So that's an important set of information and knowledge that we're working with. Secondly, that day we'd be doing a little press and, it's in sometimes a keg or in, let's say, a flex bottle, and it's starting its thing. But it takes 2 days then, sometimes even 3 days before the grapes actually arrive. Then it's in the basket press. Then we're settling it in tank, and then we're taking it to barrel. And all's the while just smelling it, just having an idea of what that's like. And then I'm going to be honest, if that starter isn't what we think it should be, we will throw it away. And then we'll just have to rely on what is in the grapes. And then but I mean, most of the times, I'm going to be honest, actually really most of the times, we've been really happy with what it looked like. And we wanted, a start off to be quite quickly. Yeah.
Cool. Maret, anything to say about Pierre de Cuve?
I think it's what Corlea said is the critical thing. You need to know your grapes and you need to know your sort of where you want to go. And I think there's a lot of technologies that have been developed that now allow sellers to actually, in a very quick space of time, analyze their must to know what microbes are available. There's a lot of chip technology where you put a drop of your must in there and it tells you within, I think, 3 hours what you have. And I think for all of us, we are working in the space of technologies being available, is to actually use that technology to better understand what are you working with than working in the dark. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, is to really make use of that and to build a data bank over time to know, as you say, when do you say this one is good and when do you say this one is bad. So, but yeah, I mean, there's so much knowledge now generated in the space of non-sack, sack, and that some of the non-sacks is actually just as good as sack. And they bring another dimension, another diversity, another flavor profile. You, in the end, as winemaker, have to decide how far you're going to let them go to produce the flavors. And everything that boils down is in the title of the session. It needs to be in balance in the wine in the end.
So the two wines that we've now got poured, I don't want to neglect the wines. The first one is wine number 3, and this is from Loic Maret, and this is Amphore 2021. So this looks like it looks a bit like a Tava. I don't know exactly which manufacturer this is. So with Amphora, when you're using clay, the key factor is the firing temperature. So ceramics fired at a very high temperature, like clavers, very little oxygen transmission at all. And if you don't fire at the right temperature, basically the wine just comes out. So the Yogi de Beer, the South African guy who Duncan Savage started working with, started making these terracotta vessels for Duncan, and the first ones started leaking because they just weren't fired at the right temperature. Now he's much more refined, making some incredible terracotta. But so that firing temperature is so critical. And the George and Kvevri, they put 8 of them in an oven, and it goes for like 3 or 4 days, to fire them. And so I guess that's an artistic thing. They're not measuring it so precisely. But I think we're seeing a lot of amphora terracotta clay used in the wine world now, and I think it's really interesting. And there's a festival in Portugal I think it's the 13th of November, which is the Feast of Saint Martin, when they have these talhas in the south of the Alentejo, which is a tradition of making wines in large clay vessels. And the 13th of November is when they tap them every year. They take the wine out and begin drinking it. But that's become an international festival for all the people who make wine in clay. And it's so interesting to go to that and taste lots of wines made in clay. And sometimes you can have a flavour of the clay as well. That's kind of interesting. So it's an extrinsic flavour. Often there's no flavour from it, but it's a vessel that lets wines develop in different ways. And I haven't tried this one yet, but I kind of think, has any of you played around with terracotta or clay? No? So I think with this, sorry. Really? Loic, show yourself. Would you like to say something about this wine?
Thank you. I just, my English is not very good. I choose this kind of vessel to put the juice in, and fermentation goes into those amphora, and it's to keep to make vinification with the reductive way and not oxidative way. The first I buy those not to make a special cuvée from amphora, but to make cuvée from wood and amphora, because I think it's what is interesting in those kind of amphora is to work in a reductive way. So it's on lease for 1 year, and the second year on lease also, but in tank.
Very cool, beautiful wine. Thank you. And then we have the fourth wine. This is yours, boss. Do you want to talk about this wine? Go on.
No, this wine I think needs time. For me, I like the goal of the domain is to produce the most purest wine as possible with that kind of freshness. The wines need to shine, and the particularity of the terroir of La Poissonnière is always to give freshness, a soft freshness, something that is very delicate but with a lot of power. I like the salinity of that wine. Usually it makes 18 months in élevage, 12 months in barrels, 6 months in inox tank. Plus we wait 1 hour to release the wines. But the choice that we made at the domain is to keep 20-25% of the production of the Clos de la Hutte to release them in 10 years, because I think that kind of wine is people are drinking it too young, and for us the time is the key to deliver the complete expression of what we want to say.
Yeah, and I really like your point earlier on saying that the people are part of terroir, because I think the best way to understand a terroir is an interpretive act. So you've got a place, And then what you're doing is you're making intelligent interpretation of that place. And I think I like music, like I play guitar. I sing very badly. I play guitar quite well. Michelle knows because with the National Wine Awards of Canada, we always do lots of busking and singing. And it's like you take a song, right? So you've got someone's song. So like the chords and the words, you know, in the melody line. That's the vineyard. And then your ability to play guitar and your ability to sing and the choices you make in terms of how you play and how you sing and what sort of how to make it your own is effectively the act of the wine grower, which is interpreting the place, but it's very much a personal thing. And I think that's wonderful when you see, you know, often in some places, you know, around the world, you'll see that many people sharing the same vineyard. And then you see the wines that come from that, they have a family resemblance. As long as the guitar's in tune and the voice is in tune, they're good wines, right? But they're different wines, but they're wines of that place. And this is what I think a very liberating way of looking at terroir. It's not something that's rigid, it's interpretive. And then it's a beautiful thing because it includes the people who work there. So it's people and place and time all encapsulated in the flavour of a wine. So I think this is a beautiful wine, and I see what you're saying about this is your interpretation of this place, that you've helped make that place come into fruition by planting the vines, the lost vineyard of the past. And that's a fantastic thing about wine. And then to have that understanding that maybe in 10 years' time this will be even more expressive of that place, I think is a really cool thing. So we have a few moments for questions. If anyone has questions for these guys, please do raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Over here.
Sure. So, excuse me, this question's for Maret on the microbe diversity or density population. Was there anything done on the age of the vineyards? Because in my mind, I can't think that it starts from scratch every vintage or every year. Does it actually build up over time? Does that maybe play a role into the bush vine or the goblet vine that chances are they were probably the older vineyards versus VSP and after 20, 35 years, whatever it might be, do you get the same sort of result?
Well, I think, Roloff, that's part of the project is because we're lucky that at the moment this vine is a young vine and we will keep on monitoring over time. But I think that's where a link probably to the old vine project can be important, is to see how does an old vine terroir and impact from a microbial ecology point of view relate to what we see in our model vineyard, and is there a resemblance? Because at the moment it definitely looks like your vine architecture because of the shading of the bunch, the humidity in the bunch, the temperature of the bunch definitely impacts your microbial ecology. But and we also saw that there's certain things that are the terroir of where we are located is there's definitely a general microbial population in all of the systems. And the rest is then probably determined by how the trellising system impacts the micro and macro climate of the bunch. But I mean, it is an important question, and I think that is where the work done in the old vine with project is really critical to help us to understand, and with the replanting of those old vines now, is to see how that translates into the microbial aspects as well. So as I said, if we get an opportunity in 2 or 3 years' time to present, but there will be workshops in the South African industry about the progress of the project, which will be open for anybody to attend. But I think it is an important question to see over time how the microbial ecology of the vineyard changes with age.
Question, just the notional topic of this particular session is balancing flavours. And when we taste the 4 wines we just tasted, it's quite clear, but to me at any rate, that there is a different picking philosophy between the first 2 and the second 2. So perhaps we could just address the whole question of moment at which you pick, question of ripeness, in terms of balancing flavours.
Yes, so to think about our wine, you have to, as I told you, we've got 10 different massal selection that allow us to have a lower degree. So if you look at the degrees, the figure don't tell you the ripeness, because the idea of maturity that you have is not the reality of our all vines. The difference that you will feel, I think, is the third three wines go through malolactic fermentation, and we don't. And to answer to your question, I think we are one of the guys that harvest later in the appellation, because we can't cheat with the quality of the wines. I think even on a cold vintage such as 21, if you look at the level of, for example, acidity and the level of malic, that give you an idea of the maturity. The malic are low because we made a lot of job in the vineyard, like we pull away all the entre, for example, to put the grapes on the light of the sun to decrease the malic acidity. So in fact, our goal is to produce that kind of wine, because for me, when I write, I was more, I don't have a family history of wine in the Loire Valleys, and that's sure that I prefer to have the wines from Saumur, from Vouvray, or from that kind of Chenin Blanc without any malolactic, that goes straight with a lot of acidity and salinity, and in fact that's the wines that we want to produce. So it's not for me a question of time to pick, because as to people that is in the vineyard, we're not the one that pick earlier. I think it's maybe the opposite, because the difference between the first two wine is the malolactic fermentation that give roundness to the wine. And if I go further of what I think people are picking earlier over the past 2 years, because the balance in the vineyard don't allow them to go to have an entire fermentation, and they want to preserve the acidity. And so the winemaking process sometimes give the time to pick, or when you want to pick, to avoid to have high degrees and things like that. For us, whatever the winemaking process, I believe that 100% will be in the vineyard and the maturity of the grapes.
Oui. Avant de poser une question à Jamie, je voudrais dire à Maret. Je voudrais dire merci, parce que avec Evelyne de Pontbriand, on était tous les deux à visiter votre installation à Stellenbosch sur les orientations. C'est passionnant, et j'espère qu'on aura des résultats comme des actes ou des écrits du travail que vous faites.
Merci beaucoup.
Et Jamie, je voudrais rebondir sur ce que tu as dit par rapport à l'intervention de Gabriel, l'épousé hier, parce que Gabriel, il a mis un petit pavé quand même dans la mare du goût, en disant il faut que les vignerons arrêtent de dire que leur vin, il tire son goût directement du schiste ou du calcaire. Nous, en ce moment, au domaine, on demande des analyses d'ADN du sol, de signature génétique du sol, de la vie dans le sol. Et en fait, on nous donne une photo qui ne nous dit pas grand-chose, d'après les scientifiques avec lesquels je travaille. Il y a 56% de la vie sur Terre qui est dans le sol. Il y a les mycorhizes dont on a parlé, il y a les colamboles, il y a les insectes, il y a des crustacés, il y a des amibes, il y a tout ça. Et la plante est absolument incapable d'assimiler directement la roche. Elle a besoin absolument de la vie dans le sol. Donc de la qualité et de la nature de la vie dans le sol et des interactions de tous ces organismes vivants va dépendre le goût du vin, en fait, aussi. avec l'autre aspect, c'est qu'on a besoin que le sol, de la conservation du sol, parce que si le sol disparaît, et si la vie disparaît dans le sol disparaîtra, nous aussi. Donc la question que je me pose, c'est comment avancer dans cette compréhension de l'interface entre la roche et la vie du sol, et la nature de la vie du sol pour la conserver et ne faire en sorte qu'elle ne soit pas détruite, quoi. Et pour avoir vraiment, le point final, c'est pour avoir des vins qui soient vraiment, on revendique des expressions de lieu. Tu as très bien décrit toutes les étapes qui sont indispensables pour que le goût arrive dans le vin. C'est une des étapes, c'est pas la seule, hein, mais elle est aussi très importante, et je pense qu'il faut qu'on se penche davantage là-dessus.
It's a good question. So in case people didn't hear this, didn't follow the French, so how do we get a better link between soils and wine flavour and the different elements of soils and wine flavour? And this is like, I think this is like the most interesting question in wine, because we can see it and taste it, yeah? And we see terroir most clearly in differences between wines, you know, where somebody's got a plot and the soil will change and then suddenly the wine changes different. Or a plot where, you know, you've got vine age where it's gone, the vine roots have gone from this just here and then suddenly they've gone down into another layer of soil or something. And suddenly you get a fascinating change in the wine because of the vine age, because the roots have explored a different level of soil. So I think that geeks like me, we often like to play the game. You get a glass of wine and you say to somebody, no, not what cépage is it, but what's the soil type? And you can do this, and you're not saying you get it right all the time, but it's like it's just a fun thing to do. I know that's one of Raj Par's favourite tricks. You know, it's like, what's the soil type? Or Dirk Niepoort's done this to me as well, and I think it's really interesting because we believe in this, but in terms of our ability to explain it, we can say what it isn't. So we can say it isn't direct translocation of soil flavour components to the glass of wine, but what we can't say why. You know, considering this big intermediary step, which is what I said at the beginning, this idea that what viticulture is doing is creating a fermentation medium for the yeasts, and then the yeasts create the flavours largely that we then perceive in the wine. It's just like from what I know about plant biology, it's going to be something really indirect, like something in the soil chemistry and the soil composition is affecting how the roots are signalling to the vine, and then that changes gene expression in the developing grapes, that then changes the levels of precursors in the grapes in some way that then alters the fermentation medium, so that the yeasts, whatever yeasts do this, then express something quite different. And this is like the best question in wine. And I think if someone gave me 5 million euros, and more 50 million euros, it's like 5 million euros, no, 50 million, then I would love to set up a research lab and try and answer these questions. But there's so many factors that you've got to isolate that it would be like you'd need to be, you know, I don't know if it's something you can break down piece by piece and then build up the whole, whether the reductionist research approach would work or whether you'd have to take a systems approach and then somehow have some really clever people with statistics to kind of tease out the actual relationships. But it really is amazing. This is why wine is amazing. It's like this is one species of a you know, I was thinking about this, we're talking about the genetics of the differences between clones. There's a few transposable elements, you know, in the mix, and suddenly you've got an expression of wine that's quite different. And that's tiny little genetic modifications that have created this myriad sort of range of flavours of wine. And all the varieties we know, there's one species, you know, and the genetic diversity of vines cultured by humans is far greater than the genetic diversity of Vitis sylvestris, you know, the native Eurasian vine that Vitis vinifera comes from. And so in the wild, there's no diversity, but human sort of like cultivation and fascination with wine has created thousands of different varieties that's far more diverse than anything found in the woods. And that's kind of interesting. And I'm aware that we've actually gone over our time. So,
I just wanted to say, Jamie, so everyone, obviously Thibaud is present. You understood that Loïc is also present. And the winemaker of wine number 2 of Domaine de Clausel, Antoine, is sitting there. If you have any questions, Antoine, if you can just raise your arm. Thank you.
so I just like, you do the closing stuff, don't you? But I wanted to thank these guys because, thank you guys, this is a really, really interesting to sit down with you and talk about all these things. Thank you so much.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Wonderful. So just a few things. We are going to break for lunch now. It's at the same place where we had lunch yesterday, so in the Jardin. Then there are 5 road trips. So be careful because there are 5 different buses. So road trip 1 is the secrets of élevage. Road trip 2, the old vines in the heart of Saumur. Road trip 3, so that means the bus 3, travel back in time with sweet Chenin wines. Number 4, taste of the terroir in Savanière in Lyon Valley. And then the 5 is the sparkling world of Loire wines. And those buses that correspond to the different trips, they are waiting for you at the same place where they were yesterday. 5 buses, correct? And it's at 2 o'clock, huh? Yeah, so we leave at 2 o'clock. Please remember to take your baggage with you now and onto the bus. Then the bus will bring you back either to Angers or Saumur, where you will be taking a train from either one of those stations, depending on where you were for your road trip, and that will take you to Tours. So please don't forget to take your luggage with you now, because we're not coming back here. And take it into the bus. Sisa? Okay, so correct. You can take your luggage after lunch for the bus. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.